I didn't disappear all at once. I became useful first. At the time, it felt like progress. Like maturity. Like finally understanding how the world works. People don't need your dreams, they need your reliability. They don't care what you feel, they care what you can carry. So I learned to carry things. Responsibilities. Expectations. Emotional weight that didn't belong to me but landed in my hands anyway. I didn't resist. I adapted. Being needed felt like proof that I mattered. And usefulness is rewarded quickly. People thank you. Trust you. Rely on you. They stop worrying when you're around. I liked that feeling not because it was power, but because it gave me a role that felt solid. In a world full of uncertainty, I had found something concrete. I told myself this was what adulthood looked like. At first, it didn't cost me much. I still had opinions, desires, a sense of direction. I just postponed them slightly. I would get back to them once things settled. Once I had helped enough. Once I had earned the right to think about myself. That logic felt fair. But usefulness expands. The more dependable you are, the more space you occupy in other people's lives and the less space remains for your own. I became the person others leaned on. The one who stayed late. The one who adjusted plans. The one who said yes without needing to be convinced. I was proud of that. What I didn't notice was how rarely anyone asked what I wanted and how rarely I volunteered the answer. Over time, the question itself began to feel inappropriate. Self-indulgent. Almost rude. Useful people don't need much. I began measuring my worth by how smoothly things ran when I was involved. If no one complained, if no crisis erupted, if everything stayed stable, I assumed I was doing well. I stopped checking in with myself and started monitoring outcomes instead. Outcomes were easier. My inner life became quieter, not because I was at peace, but because it had nowhere to go. Feelings that didn't translate into action or assistance felt irrelevant. I learned to set them aside efficiently. That skill impressed people. It scared me later. There were moments when I felt a strange ache, not sadness, not anger, just absence. Like walking into a room where something important used to be. I would notice it briefly and then dismiss it. There was always something more urgent to handle. Urgency became my shelter. The truth I didn't want to face was that usefulness gave me permission not to ask harder questions. As long as I was needed, I didn't have to wonder who I was beyond that need. My identity was functional, externally validated, constantly reinforced. I wasn't lost. I was assigned. Years passed like this. Efficient. Predictable. I became very good at solving other people's problems. Very bad at recognizing my own. When exhaustion surfaced, I labeled it normal. When resentment appeared, I buried it under more responsibility. I told myself this was sacrifice, but sacrifice implies choice. I wasn't choosing anymore. I was defaulting. The moment of realization came in the most ordinary way possible. Someone thanked me sincerely for everything I had done. They listed my reliability, my dedication, my consistency. It was meant as praise. I smiled. I nodded. And inside, something broke quietly. Because as they spoke, I realized they weren't describing me. They were describing a function. A role that could be filled by anyone willing to disappear into it the way I had. That thought terrified me. I tried to answer a question afterward, a simple one about my own future, and found myself stalling. Not because I was unsure, but because I had stopped thinking of my future as something personal. It existed as an extension of my usefulness, not as a space for desire. I didn't know what I wanted anymore. Not vaguely. Not philosophically. I genuinely didn't know. That was the first time I understood the cost of what I had been doing. I hadn't just delayed myself. I had slowly replaced myself with a role that required nothing from my inner life. I had become essential to everyone and optional to myself. Standing alone later that night, I felt an unfamiliar emotion rise. Not regret. Recognition. The sense that something irreversible had been happening for a long time without my consent. I hadn't chosen to disappear. I had chosen to be useful. And somewhere along the way, usefulness had become the only thing I was allowed to be. Usefulness doesn't feel like a trap at first. It feels like belonging. The more I gave, the more indispensable I became. And the more indispensable I became, the harder it felt to step back. Not because anyone threatened me, but because the system I had helped build no longer functioned without my constant participation. I had taught people to rely on me. Carefully. Consistently. Without ever setting boundaries that might slow them down. When something went wrong, I was the one called. When someone hesitated, they looked to me. When decisions stalled, I filled the gap. I didn't mind. I told myself this was competence. Leadership. Quiet strength. But something shifted when I realized I was no longer allowed to be tired. Fatigue became a personal failure instead of a signal. If I felt overwhelmed, I assumed I hadn't organized myself well enough. If I felt resentful, I scolded myself for ingratitude. After all, being needed is a privilege, right? That belief kept me compliant. I started noticing how my own needs felt increasingly inappropriate. Wanting rest felt lazy. Wanting space felt selfish. Wanting change felt irresponsible. I had internalized an unspoken rule: useful people don't make demands. So I stopped making them. The moral dilemma crept in quietly. It wasn't a dramatic choice between self and others. It was subtler, more corrosive. Every time I considered stepping back, someone else's difficulty appeared in my mind. A deadline. A dependency, a crisis that would become worse without me. Leaving felt cruel. Staying felt inevitable. I began to realize how deeply I had tied my sense of worth to the absence of disruption. If things worked, I was good. If things struggled, I had failed. That binary left no room for humanity, only performance. The psychological toll started showing up in my body before I admitted it in my thoughts. Sleep didn't restore me. Even on quiet days, I felt braced, like I was on call for a life that never stopped demanding attention. My mind ran constant calculations: what needs fixing next, what might go wrong, where am I needed? I couldn't turn it off. What scared me most was how invisible my struggle was. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. I was reliable, productive, stable. The kind of person others admired and trusted. Inside, I felt like I was being slowly consumed by my own competence. There were moments when anger flashed through me, sharp, surprising bursts of it. At first, I felt ashamed. Anger didn't fit the role I played. Useful people aren't angry. They're patient, accommodating, reasonable. So I suppressed it. But suppressed anger doesn't disappear. It changes shape. It turned into cynicism, detachment, a quiet bitterness that made me colder than I wanted to be. I started helping on autopilot, completing tasks without emotional engagement, checking boxes without feeling present. I was still useful. I was no longer alive. The breaking point wasn't a collapse. It was a question someone asked me casually, without knowing what it would trigger. Do you ever do anything just for yourself? I laughed. Reflexively. The question sounded absurd, almost childish. Of course I did things for myself. I rested when I could. I enjoyed small pleasures. I wasn't a martyr. But when I tried to name something, anything that wasn't somehow tied to being needed, I froze. Everything I did served a function. Even my rest was strategic. That realization hollowed me out. I began to see how trapped I was not by others, but by the version of myself I had constructed so carefully. I had become the person everyone counted on, which meant stepping away would feel like betrayal. Not because they demanded it but because I had trained them to expect it. The ethical conflict sharpened. Was it wrong to leave when people genuinely depended on me? Was it selfish to reclaim space when I had offered it freely for so long? Had I forfeited the right to choose myself by choosing usefulness again and again? There was no clean answer. Every option felt morally compromised. Staying meant continuing to erase myself. Leaving meant destabilizing lives I had woven myself into. Either way, someone would be hurt. That someone, I realized, had been me for a very long time. I started fantasizing about disappearance. Not running away dramatically, just being unavailable. Not responding. Letting things fall apart enough that someone else would have to step in. Those thoughts scared me. They felt like betrayal even in imagination. But they also felt like relief. That's when I understood how deep the damage went. When the idea of rest feels immoral and the idea of absence feels like freedom, something has gone terribly wrong. I tried to imagine a future where I stayed exactly as I was. Not temporarily, indefinitely. I saw myself becoming more efficient, more essential, more hollow. I saw my inner life shrinking to accommodate the role until there was nothing left to shrink. That image broke something open. I wasn't afraid of burnout. I was afraid of becoming nothing but my usefulness. And for the first time, I allowed myself to ask a question I had avoided for years: what happens to a person when being needed is the only way they're allowed to exist? The decision didn't arrive as rebellion. It arrived as grief. Grief for the years I had spent confusing usefulness with worth. Grief for the parts of myself I had traded away so gradually that no one, including me, noticed the exchange happening. Grief for the quiet understanding that if I didn't change something now, there might soon be nothing left to change. I had always believed that leaving, stepping back, would feel dramatic. Like a breaking point. Like a selfish act that would expose me as ungrateful or cruel. What I hadn't expected was how ordinary the moment felt when I finally stopped. I didn't quit everything. I didn't disappear overnight. I didn't burn bridges or deliver speeches. I simply began saying no softly, imperfectly, without justification. The first no felt illegal. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. Tight chest. Shallow breath. A rush of panic that told me I was doing something wrong, something dangerous. I waited for anger, disappointment, accusation. None came immediately. What came instead was confusion. People paused. Adjusted. Asked questions. Some assumed it was temporary, that I would return to normal once whatever phase I was in passed. I let them believe that at first, because I didn't yet trust myself to hold the boundary. But each no created a small pocket of space. And inside that space, something unfamiliar appeared. Silence, not the heavy, erasing silence I had lived in before, but a quieter one. One that didn't demand anything of me. One that wasn't waiting for me to fix it. At first, I didn't know what to do with that silence. I felt restless, exposed. Without constant demands, my usefulness had nothing to organize itself around. I felt disoriented, like I had stepped off a moving walkway and forgotten how to walk on solid ground. That was when the guilt returned. Not the sharp guilt of doing something wrong, the dull guilt of not doing enough. Of leaving weight behind. Of allowing others to struggle without stepping in. Years of conditioning told me that struggle meant failure, and failure meant I had abandoned my role. I had to sit with that discomfort without numbing it by becoming useful again. That was the hardest part. There were moments when I almost went back. When stepping in would have been so easy, so familiar, so relieving. I could feel how quickly I could restore the old equilibrium, how eager parts of me still were to disappear into competence. But I noticed something crucial. Every time I resisted that impulse, I felt more present. More solid. Less diffuse. Presence, I learned, feels uncomfortable when you're not used to occupying it. As time passed, the consequences of my choice became clearer. Some systems adapted without me. Some struggled longer than I expected. A few relationships changed shape, not all for the better. There were people who missed the version of me that never said no, that absorbed everything quietly. Losing that version felt like a loss to them. I had to accept that. I also had to accept something harder. I had participated in my own disappearance. No one had forced me into usefulness. I had chosen it because it felt safer than asking who I was when no one needed me. Reclaiming myself didn't mean becoming selfish or irresponsible. It meant redefining responsibility not as endless availability, but as honest participation. I could still care. Still help. Still show up. Just not at the cost of my existence. Slowly, I began to notice parts of myself returning. Not dramatically. Not as passion or purpose. But as preference. As resistance. As small internal signals that said yes or no without explanation. Those signals felt fragile at first. I protected them carefully. I started doing things that served no one but me and felt guilty about it. Walking without a destination. Sitting without productivity. Making choices that didn't optimize outcomes or solve problems. These acts felt almost rebellious, not because they were bold, but because they were unnecessary. And unnecessary felt dangerous in a life built on usefulness. But something unexpected happened. The more I allowed myself to exist without function, the less resentful I became. My anger softened. My cynicism loosened its grip. When I did help, it felt cleaner, chosen rather than extracted. I was no longer helping to disappear. I was helping from presence. If you're listening to this because you've built your life around being needed, around being reliable, around carrying what others want, hear this carefully. Usefulness is not a substitute for identity. You can be essential and still be absent. You can be praised and still be hollow. You can be needed and still be lost. I became useful, and it made me invisible, first to myself, then to the parts of life that require you to be more than a function. Stepping back didn't make me selfish. It made me real. I didn't find a grand purpose waiting underneath the role. I found something quieter and harder, the responsibility to exist even when I wasn't needed. To occupy space without justification. To rest without earning it. To matter without function. That responsibility still scares me sometimes, but I would rather carry that fear than carry a life where my only value is how much I can hold for others. I became useful and disappeared from my own life. Letting go of that role didn't give me everything back. It gave me something far more fragile. A self that finally belongs to me.